Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. Was the talks between India and China at the summit level in Chennai a success? And secondly, over the last 3 months, has Kashmir been internationalized to India's detriment? Those are the two key issues I should explore today with India's former Foreign Secretary and one of the most highly regarded exponents of foreign policy, Shyam Saran. Mr. Saran, let's start with the India-China informal summit in Chennai over the weekend. What did it achieve, and has it ushered in a new era of India-China relations?
Well, we have had many new eras in India-China relations, so I don't think we should characterize this as a major departure in the relationship. But let me say this, that in view of the fact that this was preceded by tensions rising again in the relationship, one on the issue of Kashmir, as you are aware. There has also been Chinese criticism of they supposedly, a major military exercise carried out in Arunachal Pradesh. There have also been issues related to the trade deficit between the two sides. So, given the fact that we have had these kind of irritants re-emerging in the relationship, the fact that both leaders found it still worthwhile having this summit, and in a sense bringing the relationship back on some kind of an even keel. I think that itself is a very important achievement given this backdrop. Now, going forward, what do we see happening? Well, if there was an expectation that, for example, China's penetration in India's periphery is somehow going to be somewhat slowed down, you have seen the subsequent visit to Nepal, where actually there has been an expansion in terms of China's engagement with that country, doing projects which would inevitably mean that India's influence in that country will diminish. So I don't think there should be expectations that what we see as a consistent policy over the past few years by China, number one, to keep India in a sense neutralized while it goes ahead with its game plan in terms of its global policies as well as in terms of its regional policies.
Let me begin by pointing this out to you. This visit to India was bookended with Imran Khan's visit to Beijing at President Xi's specific invitation and President Xi's visit thereafter immediately to Nepal. Was that for you a matter of concern, and did it actually tell us something about what sort of visit to India this is going to turn out to be?
Well, as I said, this visit was basically trying to make certain that the negative trend in the relationship, those negative trends do not escalate. So I think that has been achieved.
Has it? Can I interrupt there?
Yes, I think
one
so.
of the things that's happened since August is that China has been more pronounced and more perhaps intransigent in its criticism of India's handling of Kashmir. And just before he came to India, President Xi actually said to Imran Khan that China was going to keep a monitoring eye on Kashmir, that he added that China would support Pakistan on all its core interests, and more importantly, the rights and wrongs of Kashmir are well known. So isn't this a sign that China's support for Pakistan is becoming more pronounced and its own position on Kashmir more intransigent?
There is, as I said, there is no doubt that Kashmir has emerged as an important issue in India-China relations and as an irritant in India-China relations in a manner that it was perhaps not so before.
And
so
this
precisely,
is because China's position has hardened?
Yeah, precisely because of that, precisely because of these developments, having this informal summit where the leaders were able to engage with each other and perhaps, as they say, have a very frank and open kind of talk, has not resolved those issues, but perhaps has made the management of those issues somewhat easier than would have otherwise been the case.
Do you really think so? Because one of the things that was raised by the Foreign Secretary Vijay Gokhale is when he announced that together the two governments had agreed to check what he called radicalization and terrorism. Now, the real terror that India faces is sourced from Pakistan, on which we have no support from the Chinese, and it's widely believed that this week China will lend a helping hand to Pakistan to ensure it doesn't
In the
get
Financial
blacklisted
Action
and further.
Task
So,
Force.
on this issue of radicalization and terror, do we mean and say different things?
Well, that China is reluctant to confront the Pakistan involvement in terrorism. This is nothing new. I mean, this has been going on for quite some time. I think both countries are trying to project that irrespective of specific issues like that, both have a certain concern with respect to fundamentalism, with respect to radicalization, because as you know, China claims that it is facing that kind of radicalization, say, in Xinjiang.
But quite explicitly, they exclude from this the terror we face from Pakistan,
well,
which is our principal concern.
They have not mentioned that they exclude Pakistan
but we know they do.
From that. In terms of specific actions, yes. But I think overall, there is a sense that with regard to the issue of terrorism, with regard to fundamentalism, perhaps there are certain symmetries in the kind of challenges that we face.
On terrorism?
But I do not...
On terrorism, our main terror is from Pakistan.
Well, our main terror is from Pakistan. Quite right. What I'm saying is that overall, in terms of the broader principle that both sides, are concerned about terrorism, are concerned about fundamentalism, that as a principle is okay. Quite right. When it comes to actual policies, when it comes to measures that actually they take, certainly there has not been any doubt that Pakistan has, in a sense, got a pass from China on the issue of
So, are you
terrorism.
on the issue of terror saying that the rhetoric from China is okay, but the action that we badly want to see is missing?
Well, certainly action that we want to see with respect to Pakistan is certainly not there.
Therefore, let me ask you this. Before President Xi came, there was growing concern in India that the Chinese attitude to Pakistan was strengthening and their criticism of Kashmir was becoming stronger and more public, and therefore this was disquieting. Has that been ameliorated or capped as a result of the summit?
I don't think one can say it has been capped. As I said, this summit has not perhaps resulted in resolving any of the outstanding issues.
But they haven't got worse either.
But number one, they have not got worse. But I think when it comes to a sense that the overall relationship between India and China is important and therefore should be kept on some kind of an even keel, there should be evenly balanced, I think that has come out quite clearly from this summit. So that is from our point of view, that is a gain, but I don't think we should make too much of the outcome.
You're saying that there's a sense in which the overall relationship is back to even keel. But if you look at what President Xi said as soon as he arrived in Nepal, he presented China in Nepal as the guarantor of Nepal's sovereignty, territorial integrity and independence. Now, that's a role that India's played. And that gives the impression that Xi is trying to actually challenge the India-Nepal relationship.
I already mentioned to you that if there was any expectation that there would be somehow a slowing down of China's penetration of India's periphery, that is not the case.
And in fact, in Nepal, it became worse.
True, but it's not that this is something which has suddenly happened. We have seen a certain pattern over the last several years that as China's own economic capabilities, its security capabilities have increased, its involvements in engagement with countries which are neighboring to India, that has also increased. It's not only Nepal. We see this in Bangladesh. We see this in Sri Lanka. We have seen this in the past in the Maldives.
So isn't it now more disquieting because these words spoken in Nepal for the first time present China as a guarantor of Nepal's integrity?
I think we have to acknowledge the fact that there is a growing asymmetry of power between India and China.
They've been well ahead of us.
If there is a challenge, the major challenge for us today is how do you deal with that asymmetry? And especially, as you say, it seems as if that asymmetry is expanding going into the future rather than shrinking. It means, therefore, that options that you have in terms of foreign policy, those options have relatively speaking, have shrunk somewhat compared to the past. So we have to deal with that reality. Now, in terms of that reality, keeping the relationship with China, despite that asymmetry, on some kind of an even keel, is at this particular point of time still an advantage to India.
Which means that the real benefit of these talks over the weekend is that they kept the relationship going. It didn't deteriorate. There was a conversation between the two heads of government, and the process of talking continues.
Yes, continues, and perhaps in terms of some specific issues. Take, for example, the issue of the trade deficit between the two countries.
Set up a mechanism.
They have set up a mechanism. Now, merely setting up a mechanism does not necessarily mean that this is going to give results.
But there's a hope.
But I think the fact that it has been raised to such a senior level, hopefully there will be greater amenability that we see on the Chinese side to address some of our concerns.
And
on
similarly,
the trade
there
issue.
was a glimmer of hope on the border issue, because the statement that was issued, the press statement, talked about the special representatives getting together. But again,
yes.
just
So
a
I
glimmer of hope.
understand that the special representative may be meeting sometime in December this year. But also I consider it also worthwhile that there is a very specific mention of the political parameters and guiding principles for resolving the border issue, which was adopted in 2005 and which I think was an important
and which
development.
something China had earlier seemingly backed away from.
That's right. So a reiteration of that we will be seeking a solution on the basis of the provisions of these principles. I think, again, I would not like to make too much of it, but the fact that this has been referred to means that we are trying to at least get back to a situation where some of the principles that had been agreed between the two sides, these will be, in fact, still the basis on which we go forward.
Let me then sum up what we are, in a sense, saying about the China-India outcome from this summit. The fact that the two heads of government, at a time when the relationship had this element of friction because of Kashmir, met, is itself a good sign.
Yes.
It suggests the talks are continuing.
Yes.
It suggests the
And
process
I
is
think we
continuing.
have to also take into account the fact that quite clearly the atmosphere of the talks and the meetings was in fact very positive.
And the second positive is that there are glimmers of hope, both about the trade deficit and a glimmer of hope about the border. And there's something more than a glimmer of hope in the sense that the Chinese have gone back to standing by the 2005 principles.
So, let me put it this way, that even when there are differences between the two sides, the willingness to talk through some of those differences will count as a gain.
But issues that matter to India, like the NSG or the United Nations Security Council permanent membership, or even Huawei, don't seem to have come up.
No.
Those have been sidestepped.
They have been. I don't know whether or not, for example, Huawei was discussed or not. But if there was a sense that this summit has led to actually some of the major outstanding issues being resolved or being on the road to being resolved.
That's not the case.
That's not the case.
Okay. So, overall, there are a few positive signs, but one mustn't overstate it.
Must not overstate it. Quite right.
Let's then move beyond India-China relations and broaden our canvas and talk about the way the world, and I mean largely the Western world, has responded to the constitutional changes India has carried out in Kashmir. And at this point, let me distinguish between two things. India's stand that the constitutional changes are an internal matter and they don't concern the outside world, and the international community's concern about the detentions, the lockdown, and the alleged human rights violations. On the first, India's stand that this is an internal matter and the world shouldn't interfere about the constitutional changes. Would you say that, by and large, with the exception of a couple of countries, the world seems to have accepted India's position and agreed?
Yes. I think the stand taken by India, if you look at the official comment from various countries, with the exception of course, China. We have also seen a reaction from Turkey as well as from Malaysia. But by and large, I would say that there has been a muted reaction to what India has done in Jammu and Kashmir.
And this, in a sense, is in fact emphasized by the lament that Imran Khan publicly expressed on his return from the United Nations when he said he was greatly disappointed by the fact that the world had not
Quite right.
supported
I think
and responded
Pakistan,
to his concerns.
despite all its efforts, and with some support from China, Pakistan has not been able to get any international traction on the Kashmir issue.
So, in a sense, this is a diplomatic success for India.
It is a diplomatic success, but I think we should recognize also that much depends upon how the situation within Kashmir itself
and
evolves.
I'll come to that in a moment's time. But I'm still sticking to the fact that, with the exception of 2 or 3 countries, the world seems to have accepted that the constitutional changes are an Indian internal matter
Yes.
and not for the world to comment on.
Quite
Let me
right.
come to those 2 or 3 countries that did dissent. The first is the Kashmir Contact Group of the OIC. And in fact, that put out a statement very clearly saying that the rescinding of 370 should be revoked. They wanted no demographic changes. They wanted a halt to human rights violations. They wanted the withdrawal of the military and the repeal of draconian emergency laws. Now, normally, India would not take the Kashmir Contact Group seriously. But this time around, the statement was actually signed by Saudi Arabia, a country that we in the last 3 years have begun to consider a friend, if not almost an ally. And if Saudi Arabia sign on, that would suggest that Crown Prince Mohammed is quite happy with Saudi Arabia signing on. Is that an issue of concern?
Well, there would be an issue of concern, but if we are looking at the history of OIC resolutions and OIC contact group, frankly, apart from being a little annoyance, what have they meant in terms of real ground reality or in terms of India's foreign policy? I don't think that we should pay much attention to what the OIC is saying.
That's absolutely true of the contact group as a whole. But are you worried by the fact that Saudi Arabia, a country with which we've invested so much effort recently, has signed on?
Saudi Arabia, many other countries sign on to various kinds of resolutions. And then next day come and tell us, this is a body where we work by consensus and, it is very difficult for us to oppose this. I have seen this a number of times. So, that Saudi Arabia has also signed on to it is something that we should take note of. But I'm not particularly concerned about OIC resolutions.
And this doesn't affect our relationship with Riyadh?
I do not think so. I mean, after all, whether it is the Gulf countries or even a country like Iran, the relationship continues as before. I mean, after all, these countries also have a strong interest in India. India is today the second largest importer of oil. And I think with respect to the interests of the Gulf countries, India is an important player.
What about the response of Mahathir Mohamad, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, who at the UN said that India had invaded and occupied Kashmir, and then he added, whatever India's reasons, it is still wrong. And he said this 3 weeks after meeting Narendra Modi in Vladivostok.
Yeah. So again, I would ascribe this more to the personality of Mr. Mahathir Mohamad himself, rather than as a considered position of Malaysia or reflecting in any way the position of the ASEAN countries. He has been known to be somewhat acerbic and somewhat blunt in his statements. Again, I would not pay much attention to that.
Except that India reacted very strongly and has threatened that it could in fact cancel edible oil imports from Malaysia, India being one of the biggest importers. And it seems Mahathir Mohamad hasn't taken that very kindly and said that as of now, India's done nothing, but it waits to see.
Yes. So,
are we allowing this to deteriorate our relations with Malaysia?
As I mentioned, I do not believe that a statement made by Mahathir Mohamad necessarily is a very serious setback for us, because it is, as I said, much more of a personal kind of reaction of Mahathir Mohamad, who's even in the past has not been known to be particularly friendly towards India. So I do not pay much attention to that. That the government of India has reacted, well, I think this government is also somewhat, as I have pointed out earlier, somewhat tough in the projection of its policy. So that too is not much of a surprise to me.
The third country is Turkey. President Erdogan, again at the UN, was very critical of what India had done. Now, is Turkey's response explained by the fact that Turkey is a long-standing traditional ally of Pakistan?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and Turkey too, I mean, there is a certain history in terms of Turkey's positions on issues between India and Pakistan. So again, that is not much of a surprise.
Both Turkey...
Let's take the point that with a few exceptions, I think India can take heart from the fact that what could have been a much more serious, much more critical reaction from the international community, India has in fact probably managed to weather this without too much difficulty.
How much heart do you take from the fact, or how much are you dismayed, I should ask, by the fact that Malaysia, Turkey and China, the three together, intend to throw Pakistan a lifeline at Fatah this week? Or is that only to be expected?
Well, if China is going to be the chair of the Fatah, then
which it will be.
Yes, that's why I mentioned that. What I think we should expect is that perhaps Pakistan will continue to be on the grey list. It may be difficult for China as chairman to take Pakistan off the list, particularly when the Asia Pacific part of the FTA
has recommended blacklisting.
Exactly.
But
so
you're also saying,
I think Pakistan would be more than happy if it just manages to remain on the grey list.
And you're also suggesting that the real service China, Malaysia and Turkey will do is to ensure it doesn't get onto the blacklist.
It stays on the grey list, and I suspect that the United States of America, which will have a strong influence in that group because of Afghanistan, and because there continues to be a sense, at least among some sections in the United States, that Pakistan is still critical in terms of a solution to the US-Afghan problem.
So US will also be protective.
May not resist it too much.
Let's now come at the stage.
But I don't think that the US will stand for its actually being taken off the list.
So there are several countries that together, for their different reasons, go to ensure that Pakistan doesn't go to the blacklist. But you are fairly certain in your mind that no country will actually push them off the list.
I may be wrong, but that is my sense is that is what is going to happen.
Let's at this point, Mr. Saran, come to the second issue. The international community is concerned about the detentions, the lockdown, and the allegations of human rights violations in Kashmir. On this issue, the British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, the EU High Representative Federica Mogherini, and the United States Acting Assistant Secretary of State all have spoken out fairly critically. Do you get the feeling that on this second issue, Western governments are not prepared to turn a blind eye or to keep silent?
I would say that the immediate reaction did not surprise me from the people whom you have mentioned. But if actually we are able to normalize or relatively normalize the situation in Jammu and Kashmir as we go along, I suspect that you will not see any kind of follow-up in terms of these kind of statements.
Up till now, and we don't know what will happen in the future, as you say, if we normalize. But up till now, let's focus on the American response. Alice Wells publicly said the United States is concerned by the widespread detentions and the restrictions on the residents of Jammu and Kashmir. Separately, leading American senators like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have spoken out in particularly critical terms. And now next week on the 22nd, the House of Representatives Foreign Affairs Committee will be holding a special hearing on Kashmir. How do you read this American reaction?
Well, there will be a reaction, I mean, look at it from the point of view of the European Union or the United States, or particularly the US Congress. When something like this happens, you can't expect them to, remain silent. So it's almost as if there is a certain responsibility that these countries feel that they must comment on this situation. However, as I said, having made those statements, having put forward their stand, whether this will escalate, whether this will become a more serious issue, depends really on how the situation in Kashmir evolves. So some of the limited things that have been happening recently, we know the release of at least some of the people who were under detention, the fact that the PSA has been withdrawn from some of the young people who had been detained.
Except it now seems to have been slapped onto Mehbooba Mufti and Omar Abdullah.
Well, we don't know, because there seems to be some contradiction there. But be that as it may, the fact is that there seems to be a willingness to, in incremental measures, to try and bring about a relaxation in some of the curbs which have been put. The mobile telephones have been, restarted.
But SMS closed within hours.
Yes, because there was apprehension of some terrorist act. But if the general trend over the next several days, and I hope that will continue to be the case, if there is a steady normalization of the relationship, steady release of the people who have been put under detention, then my sense is that you will not see much more of these kind of statements emerging from either the United States or from the European Union.
Let's focus for a moment on President Trump, who seems to have been, in his personal terms, very equivocal. He began by calling Mr. Modi's Houston speech very aggressive. Then the White House readout of the conversation they had in New York categorically went out to say that Trump had encouraged Modi to improve ties with Pakistan and fulfill his promise to better the lives of the Kashmiri people. Third, Trump refuses to accept that Pakistan is the epicenter of terror. He says that is Iran. And finally, when he was questioned about Imran Khan's public admission that the Pakistan army has been training Al-Qaeda, Trump deliberately sidestepped the issue. Do you get the feeling that Trump is unwilling to hold Pakistan responsible in the way we in India would like him to do?
Well, it's playing both sides. As far as Trump is concerned, when he's with Prime Minister Modi, and particularly during the rally at Houston, there was a projection of a very, very strong and positive relationship between the two countries, and personally between President Trump and Modi himself. Now, when it comes to Pakistan and when it comes to Imran Khan, the fact is, as I mentioned earlier, that there is an issue of Afghanistan and a perception, which I do not agree with, but there is a perception in the United States that the way to extricate, as President Trump says, extricate the United States from Afghanistan, Pakistan's role will be key. So playing to Pakistan and playing to Imran Khan, while also at the same time, playing to India, I think we should be mature enough to accept that this kind of thing will happen. I think what is very important is that India-US relations in reality remain very strong. The cooperation that we have, for example, on counterterrorism, the defense cooperation that we have between the two countries. We have recently had the Malabar exercises. There has been an upgradation of the Quad to the ministerial level. These, to me, are more important than, the sundry statements made by the
I accept
president.
all you're saying, but on the critical issue of American support for the terror that we get from Pakistan, as long as Trump is president, we don't have that in equivocal terms.
Well,
it's a pretty
if you are
balancing act he's doing rather than supporting us.
Yes, he's as I said, he's juggling all these elements together. But
that can't be good news for us.
If our expectation is that as far as the issue of cross-border terrorism is concerned, it is the United States of America which will resolve this problem for you, I think that is a very, not a realistic expectation. This is something that you will have to deal with yourself.
But on this specific issue of cross-border terrorism, hasn't there been a diminution of the American support we get compared to the days of Obama and George Bush? They seem to be much more supportive of India than he is.
Even during the time of George Bush, there was, in fact, George Bush would tell us, Pervez Musharraf is your man. I mean, he's bringing about a major change in Pakistan, and we should all support him. So this is a story which has been going on for quite some time. As I said, it should not be the expectation of India that the United States of America will somehow or the other pull the chestnuts out of the fire for you as far as cross-border terrorism is concerned. If you are able to get the United States of America to lean on Pakistan on the issue of cross-border terrorism, if there is a international focus on Pakistan-based terrorism, I think those are gains for us. But as far as the ground reality is concerned, this is something you have to deal with yourself. And in that context, what you do internally in terms of, making your borders safer, making sure that the kind of incursions which take place, because there is smuggling going on, there is other kind of traffic going on, these create opportunities for terrorism. So much more work has to be done by us in terms of hardening our security.
Finally, let me come to the Western media, and I'm talking specifically now about the media from the English-speaking world. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the London Times, the Telegraph, the Guardian, BBC, Al Jazeera, CNN, Voice of America, all of them uniformly have been critical both of the constitutional changes as well as the ground reality in terms of detentions and lockdowns in Kashmir. In fact, the BBC and the New York Times regularly publish stories suggesting continuing human rights violations. How concerned should we be about this?
Well, any negative publicity about India is something that should concern us. I mean, there is no doubt about that. But again, I would like to caution you that we have in the past too not necessarily had a very favorable press from all the venerable magazines and newspapers you are mentioning. So I again do not take this too seriously. We should be, of course, we should put our own narrative out. We should be ready to respond to whatever criticism is coming.
Imran Khan gives interviews, Mr. Modi doesn't, and in fact, worse still, Mr. Modi is not comfortable speaking English. So we're on the back foot when it comes to the Western
I don't
media.
think we are on the back foot. You have a foreign minister who is extremely articulate, and I think he has been going around the world, putting India's case forward on Jammu and
America,
Kashmir.
Not, I think, to the Western media. I don't think he's given too many interviews.
Oh well,
the two are different.
Maybe he should give more interviews. But what I'm saying is that even though Mr. Modi may not have given press conferences, I have seen several statements by Mr. Jaishankar, where I think he has done a good job in terms of at least in a difficult situation, putting forward a credible case for what India has done.
Let me come to the key question.
People may disagree with that, but at least an effort has been made to
Let me come to the key
that.
question. We're talking about the responses of various Western governments to the ground situation in Kashmir. We're talking about the response of the media. Does all of this collectively suggest that Kashmir has been internationalized to India's detriment?
Well, I hate to admit this, but I think that is true. That, whatever we may have done, the reasons we may have done it, Kashmir is back in focus, in a sense, in the international arena. And that is not good for us. We have always try to get away from that, because it also is a peg for hyphenation between India and Pakistan.
Is that hyphenation happening?
Well, obviously, because if as you said, President Trump is talking about, mediation between India and Pakistan, or is saying that, India should have better relations with Pakistan. As far as the subcontinent is concerned, you are in danger of being back in a situation where it is India-Pakistan which becomes the focus, rather than the bigger role of India in Asia, the bigger role of India globally. The kind of, we had made, in a sense, a break from that hyphenation earlier.
That's being reversed.
I won't say it is reversed, but it is certainly being threatened to some extent. So this is a negative
How big a
development.
negative is it?
At the moment, not so serious. But as I once again would like to say that a great deal depends upon how the situation in Jammu and Kashmir itself
This is, I think,
evolves.
the fourth time you've said a lot depends upon
Yes,
how
it
the
does.
situation in Jammu and Kashmir develops. And many people say, for India, the critical moment will be when the lockdown is fully lifted. In a
Yes.
sense, the fact that postpaid mobile phones are permitted is a partial lifting, but we know that SMSs were cancelled within hours.
Agreed.
Are you worried that this could be a critical turning point
You know,
whenever the lockdown is lifted?
For me, of course, we should be looking at what the international reaction is, and how do we manage that international fallout. But I'm more concerned, as I think I have written also, I'm more concerned about the implications of what has been done and what is being done, what the implications are for our own country, for our own people. Yes, we should be concerned about how the world is looking at
But
this.
more concerned about what it means for us.
Yes, that is, I think, should be our focus.
Briefly, spell out the principal concerns in terms of implications for us.
Well, if you see the manner in which this has been carried out, this change has been carried out, is this a precedent for example, something like this happening somewhere else?
You're talking about states being split in two and demoted.
Yes, that while one may say that this is sui generis, that this is something specific to Jammu and Kashmir, but once a precedent has been created, it is something that one would worry about what it may mean for the future. The other aspect, of course, is that if we are looking at the manner in which it has been carried out, it's you have not gone through any process of consultation. You are looking at the people of Jammu and Kashmir as if they are prodigals who have to be brought back to the fold. I don't think that this is something that in a vibrant democracy like India, something like this should happen.
You're suggesting that this raises serious questions about India's functioning as a constitutional democracy?
Yes, it does.
And it also,
I mean, that's my view. That I think there has been, in all the applause about what has been done in Jammu and Kashmir, these aspects which could also become precedents for the future. These perhaps have not been fully appreciated.
And if the Supreme Court, and it's a huge if, were to actually rule that the manner in which 370 was abrogated, or the manner in which the state was demoted and split into two, breaches the letter or the spirit of the Constitution, that could become a huge embarrassment as well.
Yes, but let us see what the Supreme Court is able to say on this.
My last question.
Yeah.
People say that when India was growing at 7, 8 and 9% levels, it was a country of increasing strategic importance internationally, and it also offered almost an unrivaled economic opportunity to international investors. Now that our growth rate has slipped to 5% levels, our strategic importance seems to have diminished. The opportunity we offer is not quite the same. Earlier, at 8 and 9% levels, people didn't raise issues like Kashmir. It didn't suit them to do so. Now, at 5% levels, would that reluctance to raise Kashmir disappear or diminish?
We have to recognize, and I think just a couple of days ago I wrote this in the Tribune, that India's diplomatic space expanded during the period 2003 to 2007, precisely because we were seen as growing at the rate of 8 to 9% per annum. There was a asymmetry still between India and China. India's GDP was much smaller even then compared to China. But the difference was that India was seen as shrinking that gap. So India was being touted as the next China, as the great, new opportunity that was coming up in terms of commercial opportunities and economic opportunities. Let me say that something like the Indo-US nuclear deal may not have been possible
At 5%.
at 5%. So there is no doubt that how you are seen as an economic prospect, as a commercial prospect, has an impact in terms of your diplomatic space. And if we are not able to get back to that growth rate, and seen as shrinking the gap with China instead of that gap expanding, need not be that you get to the same level as China, but whether you are seen as actually shrinking that gap. If you are seen as shrinking that gap, your diplomatic space will expand. So at this particular point of time, I think we are in fact entering a stage where that diplomatic cloud that you say is somewhat shrinking. Which is the reason why, if you look at our periphery, look at our neighborhood, the ability of China to penetrate in these areas is precisely because the resources that they are able to bring to the table is much more in scale than we can.
How concerned are you about this?
I'm deeply concerned about this. I'm deeply concerned about this because at the end of the day, the most important foreign policy priority for you has to be your neighborhood. If you can't get your neighborhood right, then it's very difficult to think in terms of a credible, regional role or a global role.
So in a sense, the conclusion we're coming to, if I can use that word conclusion, is that the manner in which the economy has moved in the last 2 years is diminishing India's diplomatic space.
No doubt about that. And if, for example, the debate about RCEP, whether India should become a part of the RCEP or not, the questioning of, India entering into trade agreements with various partners. See, if you do not take part in the RCEP, if you start withdrawing from the global economy, then you cannot sustain an expansive foreign policy with a marginal economic role. I think we should be quite clear about that.
In fact, as our economic growth shrinks, we need to be a member of the RCEP even more so.
Or even more so, I think it is extremely important that you should not be pushed to the margins of the global economy. Quite apart from the fact that, raising protective tariff walls, trying to protect industry, all this takes us back to the pre-91-92 era.
All of these are retrogressive signs on the Indian horizon.
It was the import substitution strategy which was bankrupt, which we jettisoned rightly so in 91-92.
And now we're half embracing again.
We saw the results. It is the globalization of the Indian economy which gave us that kind of acceleration in our growth rate. If you are going to get off the globalization track, and if there is greater emphasis being put on, say, economic self-reliance, you become more autarkic in terms of your economic policies, then you cannot sustain, again I say, sustain a more expansive foreign policy.
Now, side by side with the impact our economic growth and the economic policies, particularly trade policies they're talking about, have had on India's foreign policy breadth and depth and space, in the last 3 months, we've also done things in Kashmir that have, in a sense, internationalized Kashmir and also perhaps brought back somewhat of that hyphen that we don't want.
Well, let's put it this way, that as a result of the sort of declining trends in the Indian economy, managing the fallout
is more difficult.
Is perhaps more challenging than it would otherwise have been the case.
It seems that you do have some fairly serious concerns about the impact of Mr. Modi's policies, Kashmir and the economy, just to name two in particular, on India's foreign policy space.
Well, whatever be the justification for what may have been done in Jammu and Kashmir, and there are pros and cons about it, as we are well aware. I think what is important is, what do you want as a role for India going forward. Certainly, Mr. Modi would suggest that he looks at the role for India in a somewhat ambitious terms. That India should be in the front ranks of major powers.
But some of his policies are contradicting that.
Major power.
But some of his policies are contradicting that.
His foreign minister has said that India is not only an emerging country, it is a leading power. So if you have ambitions to be a leading power, then you need various pillars for that. You need the political pillar, you need the economic pillar, you need also in today's world, you need the science and technology pillar. So you cannot just sustain a expansive, ambitious foreign policy merely on the basis of what I think is most admirable, the energy that Prime Minister Modi has brought, to India's foreign policy.
None of this gainsays the fact that the impact of the economy and our attitude to trade is not providing the pillar
It is not at this point of time in sync with the foreign policy objectives that have been articulated.
And the same, in a sense, is true of the internationalization of Kashmir and the extent to which the hyphenation with Pakistan seems to be.
So the hyphenation with Pakistan, internationalization, as I said, it is in incipient stage. It is not something that is a major challenge at this point of time.
All depends upon what happens when the lockdown lifts.
It could become, and having a strong economy, having a growth rate which is seen as accelerating rather than decelerating is a very important part of how you are able to run your foreign.
As a former foreign secretary, you'd say one of the most important things, if not the most important thing, is get your economy to grow at 8% levels again.
Absolutely, no doubt about it, because my experience as foreign secretary during 2004, 2006, as I mentioned to you, that it was precisely that sense in the international arena, that here was a country which was going to be the next China in economic terms, but with the added advantage that this would be a very, very major economy which would also be a very vibrant plural democracy. Both these things were important in terms of creating the space which allowed something very historic like the Indo-US nuclear deal possible.
And the functioning of the economy has raised question marks over one, and for some Western countries what's happening in Kashmir could be raising question marks over the other.
Yes, to a certain point, yes.
Shyam Saran, pleasure speaking to you.
Thank you.
To receive instant updates on all videos from The Wire, click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon. Pay to support independent journalism. Click the link in the description and choose the amount you want to pay.